Thank you very much, Professor Ang, and let me join everybody over the last few days who has thanked and congratulated the organizers of the Research Forum. If there's been one constant refrain, I think, over the last 48 hours, it's that of regret of not being able to be in Catania, and I share those regrets very much, not only for all the reasons that have been mentioned, the food, the weather, the city, but also because I really very much have missed the opportunity to see many friends and colleagues that I would very much have liked to have not only heard, as I have today and yesterday, but to have shared a glass of wine, an arancini or something like that with them. So here's hoping to an occasion when we can enjoy some convivium with our seminar. But I'm very honored by this invitation, and I'm very grateful for it. It's been fascinating to listen over the last 2 days to the variety of presentations and the ways in which we have engaged the concept of solidarity in international law. Perhaps not unsurprisingly, for those of you who know me and a little bit about my work, I think I'm going to proceed with, broadly speaking, a historical account of what solidarity might mean and what its relation to international law could be. I think it's fair to say that that solidarity has played different functions in presentations and papers over the last 2 days. For some, it's an expression of an objective that international law should realize. For others, perhaps a puzzle, not even necessarily a principle of law. I approach the concept of solidarity as an essentially contested concept in W.B. Gally's famous phrase. And I should add that what that means, if one goes back to read Gally's original paper that he presented to the Aristotelian Society back in the late 1950s, was actually an observation that some concepts we can only know through their uses. To say a concept is essentially contested is not to say that we argue about it. Well, it's not only that we argue about it, but rather what Gally meant when he wrote this was that there are certain concepts we cannot aspire to give clean analytical definitions, but only that we can know them through certain historically concrete, ideal, typical usages. And I think solidarity is such a concept. The approach that I'm taking here, I think, has perhaps the greatest affinity with Wittgenstein's observation in Philosophical Investigations, where he says that some phenomena have no one thing in common which makes us use the same word for all. They are related to one another in many different ways. We see a complicated network of similarities. But is a blurred concept a concept at all? This is Wittgenstein's question, not mine. Is an indistinct photograph a picture of a person at all? Is it even always an advantage to replace an indistinct picture with a sharp one? Isn't the indistinct one often exactly what we need? So the spirit of my comments today is very much along the lines of trying to perhaps, rather than trying to provide some analytically precise, somehow definite concept of solidarity that we should or shouldn't use, rather to think somewhat historically in order to identify the complicated network of similarities and the implications of these different concepts and how they might relate to international law, if they relate at all. I think one of the interesting and as yet untouched upon questions is how the concept of solidarity came into international law in the first place. So let us begin with two etymologies of solidarity, one true and one false. The true etymology has been referred to by several presenters over the last 2 days, which is found first and foremost in English in the Oxford English Dictionary, which identifies solidarity entering into the English language around 1841 and deriving from the French solidarité. The 1841 usage, which is recorded as having been having taken place in a volume called Doherty's False Association and Its Remedies, referred to solidarité as collective responsibility. Collective responsibility is an understanding closest to the legal etymology that we have already encountered several times over the last 2 days. A solidum, as has been mentioned, is a legal condition of liability in which every creditor is severally entitled to to receive the whole object of the active obligation, and every debtor is bound to discharge the whole object of the obligation. This legal concept is found in the institutions of Gaius, and a solidum is thus an actionable civil law right, enforceable within the domain of Roman civil law. The first etymology points us to several conceptual characteristics that I would like to highlight, which I think are relevant to our understanding of the relationship between something like solidarity and international law. The first point about this etymology is that it denotes a unity of obligation, which is a legal unity, an architecture of collective credit and debt, remediable under the specific conditions of the late Roman Empire, which is the context in which Gaius' institutions were written. As the great Florentine classicist Aldo Schiavone observes, these conditions standing behind Gaius's institutiones, in which we find the concept of solidum, was, quote, none other than the figure of the princeps, the profile of imperial power. Jurisprudence now appeared to be fully enmeshed in the web of imperial authority, a legal science, whose most important function could be carried out only in the shadow of the princeps. Now, notably, this meaning of solidité, or solidum, continues as late as 1765, when, if you look at the encyclopédie of d'Alembert and Diderot, there is an entry for solidité, and it refers exclusively to this Roman legal meaning. It has no other political or legal connotation. So, to international lawyers, the concept of a solidité, which denotes a structure in which the liability or injurious action or default of one member of a collectivity can be attributed to all, or has some legal implications for all, has some obvious affinity with the legal idea of obligations erga omnes. But there is a second etymology that we can observe, one most likely fictitious. But fictitious etymologies can sometimes be useful because while the denotation of the etymology may be wrong, the connotation, the complicated network of similarities, overlapping and crisscrossing, can return us to other dimensions of the phenomena for which we use the word that are necessary to understand. The etymology here, which I would suggest is false, but nonetheless interesting, is solum, soli, solido. Earth, soil, solid. The solido is that of the earth or the soil. It is a physical, tangible state of being, solidity. What is a solid? A solid is free from empty spaces, a physical unity without cavities or interstices, firmly and continuously coherent or connected together. On this etymology, solidarity connotes not a legal unity, of the Roman law obligation, but a terrestrial one. Effectual, or most affected, when parts, bodies, materials are joined in some kind of state of being, which is more than a legal unity. So the first etymology, the etymology which points us to the notion of solidarity as legal unity, this has some affinities, it seems to me, with a set of concepts in the history of international law. The idea of a legal unity at a global scale, of a society encompassing all humanity, characterized as a civitas or respublica of law and justice, is of course a recognizable one in the history of international legal thought. It is not referred to contemporaneously as a solidum or in terms such as solidarity, but the affinity between this vision of a universal commonwealth, with its unity of human communities effected through natural laws and natural rights, and 19th and 20th century concepts of solidarity and humanity, has led writers such as Hedley Bull and others from the English school writing in the 1970s to describe this vision of global order as, quote, solidaristic, unquote. More accurately, we might call it Ciceronian or Augustinian, sources both cited by Gentili when he sought to explain why the corpus juris should be understood as embodying the law of nature and of nations. In De Jure Bella, he says, addressing the whole world as one body and all men as members of that body, Gentili notes the fundamental principle that nature has established among men: kinship, love, kindliness, and a bond of fellowship. Accordingly, subjects of other sovereigns, says Gentili, do not seem to me to be outside of the kinship of nature and the society formed by the whole world. This founding utopia of what Cicero famously called una civitas communis deorum atque hominum existimanda, a community of which both gods and men are citizens, was a Christianized Stoic ideal, one which was readily received into Christian teachings, proclaiming the brotherhood of all men, but also highly germane to the high medieval understandings of the spiritual and secular as a unity of corpus morale politicum and corpus mysticum. As Ernst Cassirer put it in his book, The Myth of the State, it evinced a totality of mankind which appeared as a single state founded and monarchically governed by God himself. Every partial unity, ecclesiastical or secular, derived its right from this primeval unity. This powerful governing ideal of humanity as an unbroken whole within a unified legal order proved itself surprisingly resilient in a variety of declensions, even as the concrete legal institutions of the medieval European order collapsed. A residue of the necessary juridical unity of all nations persisted even in Vattel's concept of what he called the necessary law of nations, which we've heard quoted several times in the last 2 days, which bound nonetheless only in foro interno. In practice, of course, the end of the real political and ideational foundations of the high medieval world ensured that the law of nature and of nations, lauded by Gentili as expressing the legal unity of all mankind, was invoked as an instrument of statecraft and tradecraft against political societies which engaged in what he deemed to be brutish practices or which failed to cultivate lands in their territories. What we might today call a vision of solidarity with oppressed subjects in Gentili went hand in hand with imperial practices. But this account of one iteration of universal justice in international legal thought is only anachronistically called solidaristic, a term which English school theorist Andrew Hurrell uses precisely to emphasize that in a society of states, quote, solidarism, unquote, is not an escape from power politics or from the politics of pluralism, but it is an additional or alternative strategy for generating, exercising, and managing power, one which relies more heavily on ideas of common value and common interest, but invariably carries with it strongly hegemonic dynamics underlying the concretization and enforcement of such rules and values. In the English school use of the concept of solidarity and solidarism, imperial orders are an important historical species of solidaristic orders. But perhaps they are not the only one. Many of the ways that the term solidarity has been used over the last 2 days lie, in fact, not within this first etymology of a legal unity of humanity, but rather within the history of the concept's usage since the late 18th century. As I noted, as late as 1765, solidité referred only to a Roman legal obligation. But within 25 years of that point, we can observe the use of the term to connote a political idea of connectedness, of cohesion. Let's think of this as part of the second etymology, solidité or solidarity as solidity, of connectedness, of cohesion, of a terrestrial unity of some kind. So, addressing the French National Assembly on the 28th of October 1789, Mirabeau speaks of the importance that there be a solidarité of public and private faith. In 1793, Danton declares, "We are all solidary through the identity of our behavior." But in the history of the French Revolution, solidarity did not go on to assume any of the political programmatic meanings of fraternity. Nonetheless, revolutionary ideals expressed modes of action and principles that we might today readily recognize as connoting solidarity. The radical Jacobin Constitution of 1793, in Article 34, articulated a principle that we would, I think, recognize as, in some sense, a principle of solidarity, when it read, where there is oppression against the social body, there is oppression against the social body when a single one of its members is oppressed. There is oppression against each member when the social body is oppressed. Jean-Pierre Gros, in his book Fair Shares for All, highlights the certain qualities of Jacobin fraternity, which seem to me to evoke dimensions of what we would now call solidarity. Jacobin fraternity evoked an affinity of connectedness, of shared membership of the national community, of unity against anti-revolutionary enemies and against adversity, but also a principle of a fair share of distribution as a corollary of one's duty to the whole. Under the circumstances of the Levée en masse of 1793-94, all able-bodied men, women, and children were required to rally around and lend a hand, to express, in other words, fraternity, but what we might think of today as solidarity. If everyone received a fair share from the political society, from the revolutionary republic, he or she must in turn give their due. Fair distribution within the family required that all should receive according to their needs and all should give according to their abilities. Now, this is not described contemporaneously as solidarity, but it is described as fraternity, which suggests to me a strong kinship in the usages that went under the idea of fraternity with usages that we now associate with solidarity. But interestingly, and I think here we come closer to the meaning of solidarity in the present, the term solidarity emerges not in the 18th century, but rather in the 19th century, in a lengthy PhD dissertation written in 1958. The sociologist Hayward noted that solidarity came into vogue as a concept seemingly apposite to restore or recreate the social and political order disrupted by Revolutionary War, the dramatic ascendancy of bourgeois liberty and laissez-faire, and severe social and political turbulence. He notes that the first use of solidarity in 19th century France was in fact by the reactionary Catholic political thinker Demestre. Demestre reached for the concept of solidarity to express a framework through which there could be a return to social stability and order in society that had been damaged by the revolution and its wars, but also by the rise of the sacralization of bourgeois liberty and the bourgeois economic order after the revolution. For him, and he refers expressly to the Roman legal concept of solidité, solidité for him refers to the contractual debt of individuals to God and society, that all of us collectively must bear responsibility for the fallen nature of human beings, for the sins that have been inflicted, and an expression of solidarity is, in fact, to unite in and return to a organic order of hierarchy. So in Demestre usage of the term in the early 19th century in France, solidarité referred to a unity, an incorporeal earthly unity that we must achieve as a nation, as a group, which reflects our fallenness as humans and our expiation, our joint need to expiate the debt that we owe to God and to Christ. The concept of solidarity, however, is also taken up in the 19th century by another radically different social and political movement, which is the self-declared socialists, Saint-Simonians, expressed by in the work of Saint-Simon and also of Leroux. In the socialists, solidarity represents a practical and democratic philosophy to apply to economic and social problems, as well as a fighting slogan for class struggle. In his work on solidarity in 1840, the socialist Leroux said that uh, that or wrote of uh, the state in which the true love would be recognized, that love would be comprehended as life's own law, as the law of mutually solidaristic creatures, as the law of the identity and hence the identification of the ego with the non-ego, of man and his fellow being, and each antinomy dissolves and egoism abases itself in the face of love. So this true love, this harmony and identity of mankind with man, is what Leroux calls solidarité. The socialist ideal of solidarité, and its expression also in various kinds of workerist and laborist movements over the 19th century, reflects ultimately a concept that is polemical in the service of a contestation of the nascent liberal economic order. To demand solidarité as workers, but also to demand solidarité as an expression of social and political order, was to demand not charity, but rather one's right to a fair share, not otherwise guaranteed through the self-interested, voluntaristic conduct of market actors. Solidarité was the expression of, as we've seen in its association, in the association with fraternity, this is partly an expression of demand for fair shares for all. The articulation of solidarity as a political combat concept in the 19th century and in France reflects in particular conditions of great political, social, and economic upheaval. From the revolutionary wars of 1800 to 1815, followed by restoration and further revolution in 1848 and 1870, the Republic and the state of France, rather, in both its imperial and republican constitutions, underwent not only great political ferment, but also tremendous economic change, a period in which the industrialization that had come to Britain towards the end of the 18th century developed and accelerated also in France. So partly at stake in discussions of, or in debates over over solidarity and the notion of solidarité, is precisely an account as to the nature of the unity of political society. What is its foundation? What is its source of togetherness, of cohesion? On what basis can we establish solidarity and to what ends? So, somewhat paradoxically, while the term itself is recovered at the beginning of the 19th century through an express reference to a legal concept, it is transformed into an entirely political concept during the 19th century. It no longer refers in any real way to a legal unity in this usage, but rather is the foundation, or is the vector through which a variety of visions of political unity express themselves. From Demestre, theological, reactionary unity of all in their sin, in the expiation of their moral collective debt, to the Saint-Simonian ideal of solidarity as an expression of the possibilities of cooperative unity through the forms of mutual aid and sociability that could be found within contemporary industrial societies. It was an alternative mode of organizing, alternative basis to organize a social order from that of the classical political economy that seemed at that moment victorious. And of course, interestingly, there were moments of intersection, periods of intersection between this Catholic vision of solidarity and the socialist. While in the 19th century, the church and Catholic intellectuals never embraced socialism because they saw it as fundamentally atheistic and materialistic and fundamentally committed to a rejection of social hierarchy, Catholic thinkers nonetheless coined the concept of social justice, expressing an idea of a brotherhood of man, of an order of not just of rights, but of rights and duties, of reciprocal obligation between worker and capitalist, as a vision of a corporatist political and social order in which the solidarity of the whole was embedded within structured relationships of hierarchy as an alternative to the socialist vision of radical equality. So within this landscape of concepts of solidarity, we can observe that partly what's at stake, in fact, is the foundation of the state and its duties to its citizens, how to best conceptualize those and how to argue for them. In fact, in international law, it seems to me, the concept of solidarity the foundation of the entry of the concept of solidarity into international law is most closely associated with the work of a group of intellectuals who are sometimes referred to as syndicalist solidarists. They were a liberal socialist, social liberal group comprising of figures such as Durkheim, Duguy, and Bourgeois. They, in some ways, sought to articulate a concept of solidarity, which was both descriptive and normative. Famously, Durkheim's account of social solidarity was an argument about the nature of bourgeois society, in his role as in his pioneering function as a sociologist. Durkheim described an idea of sociology of solidarity in modern society, which emphasized interdependence due to the division of labor. For him, this was not merely a sociological fact. It was a sociological fact which had clear political implications as to how to understand the foundation of an effective state, and also how to understand the nature of law. Law was no longer to be properly understood as an emanation of the sovereign will, in the rejection of both the naturalistic accounts of individual right and of contractarian accounts of the authority of law. Instead, the solidarist, in this sense, the solidarist understanding of law saw it as an effective form of managing and regulating already potentially harmonious social interests. So the purpose of a legal order was to reflect the objective possibilities of interdependence and cooperation that existed in modern society, and in some sense, to simultaneously enact those solidarities. For example, instead of insisting on a pure right to contract as the expression of an individual will, right, in the Durkheimian account, this would be a fallacy of naturalism, to think that these natural rights have some separate, ethereal, abstract existence apart from the functional reality, the sociological reality of workers and employers contracting in modern industrial conditions. So for him, the implication would be that collective bargaining should be authorized under a legal framework, because to do otherwise is to ignore the sociological reality of conditions under which workers exchange their labor for wages. So solidarism in this sense entailed a project of legal reform, but it also entailed a project of social reform, one in which it was to be understood that the proper function of the state was not purely to protect individualistic rights such as property, but rather to provide forms of social assurance to enable the maintenance of social solidarity. So social solidarity is both a fact, imminent, incipient in modern society, and it's also a prescriptive desiderata, something that needs to be maintained, managed, regulated through laws that reflect that possibility. This leads to a close association with the notion of solidaristic policy and what we would now think of as welfare policy. And indeed, this is one of the senses in which solidarism as a political and ideational movement endowed us with the concept of solidarity, which we still use today when we speak of solidaritat, or the solidaristic social state. We are essentially using a term that emerges in the late 19th century, partly within contexts of debate and discussion that characterized or that reflected this solidaristic theory. So, for example, the implication for law was drawn out by de Guy, one of Durkheim's followers. He argued that in order to promote and protect solidarity, this social fact of the modern world, the state was under a juridical obligation, the law of solidarity being anterior and superior to the law of the state, to pass laws guaranteeing social security and public health, to provide full employment for able-bodied and public assistance for those, infants, invalids, the ill and the aged, unable to support themselves, promoting the physical and intellectual development of each individual, and where, if necessary, involving the acquisition of private property and education. Now, within that description, I think we can identify the lineaments of what we might think of today as the essential dimensions of social protection. And I think this is one of the reasons that, particularly in the post-war period, states committed themselves often expressly to policies of solidarity. And by policies of solidarity, they meant national welfare. But what implications did this kind of thinking have for international law? Here, the lineage is striking and in some ways direct. I think we've already been introduced to the idea that one of the associates of this line of thinking, Georges Sell, was of himself an influential international lawyer. But we might say, and we might observe, that the building blocks of this theory tended towards thinking of the state as a set of functional competences that helped discharge the necessity of promoting social solidarity through those functions, such as health, such as education. So incipient in this theory of the state, in solidaristic thinking, was a functionalization of the state and a commitment to the idea that those functions can and should be enhanced as much as possible. So this has clearly an implication for how we think about sovereignty. Sovereignty is nothing more than the legal protection which is necessary for the discharging of these functions of solidarity. Right? So sovereignty in this account, pardon me, has no strong ontological status. It has no it has no dogmatic importance. It's rather the expression of a legal rule that reflects a particular kind of function, and the function and the nature of the state is itself, in the solidaristic account, functionalized into objective competences and performances that are necessary for the continuation and maintenance of social solidarity. Well, in light of that theory and that consequence of solidarity, as a consequence of the meaning of solidarity, it's not difficult to imagine and envisage that this theory leads to an understanding of the state that is highly compatible with modern international organization thinking. And indeed, Duguy himself expressed this view. For him, the same juridical social norms applied between states as within them. These are both expressions of what he regarded as objective social law. And the absence of a superstate did not invalidate an international law founded on what he called objective international solidarity. He regarded the creation of a League of Nations as a step in the right direction, but he concluded that absolute national sovereignty had not been sufficiently tamed for international law to be effectively enforced. He, in fact, endorsed the idea of specialized agencies dealing with health, labor, education, and trade as positive contributions to international solidarity. His notion of the provision of public services by the domestic state could be simply extended to the international plane, and it had exactly the same raison d'etre. He wrote, if there is to be a solidarity, an intersocial solidarity, une solidarité intersociale, it must be the creation of intersocial public services, services publics intersociaux, like the solidarity like the intrasocial solidarity is the creation of internal public services. So on this account, what we think of as the functional specialization of international organizations, right, what we've often understood as their technical expertise in the social domain, something I think which is very well described and treated in Guy Sinclair's book, To Reform the World, is for Duguy a logical expression of what an objective international solidarity, solidaristic social law would require, to the same extent that what he refers to, you notice he doesn't even here refer to the state, he refers to solidarité intrasociale, and he refers to service public interne. The state is simply this collection of public services, the function of which is to maintain and preserve solidarity within a community. And there is no reason, there is no ontological reason, no dogmatic reason why there could not be intersocial social law in the manner of international organizations. Now, the compatibility, I think, of this sort of late 19th century solidaristic thinking with the origins of mid 20th century international organizational thinking, it should, I hope, be fairly clear. But there's another interesting and I think quite direct connection between this school of thought and modern international organization and indeed modern concepts of collective security. One of the adherents of Duguay's thinking, Léon Bourgeois, became ultimately Prime Minister of France, and in the process of after the First World War, was actively involved in the drafting of the League of Nations Covenant, and expressed in a way through these theories, expressed a similar understanding of the role of international law, not as, in some sense, jus inter gentes, but rather as a form of public law for social orders. And he was an advocate of the notion of collective security precisely on these grounds, that an adequate social solidarity at the national level could in some ways be recreated at the level between social orders, provided the law itself both captured and encoded the possibilities of social solidarity through mechanisms of collective action. So there's an interesting dimension, I think, to this solidaristic thinking in which law both rests upon an existing social solidarity, which is considered to be a fact of interdependence, right? Simply the nature of the international community that we live in. But at the same time, law has a special function of encoding those regularities, encoding that social solidarity, and stabilizing and reproducing it by discharging those functions. So law here is both a substantive agent for the reproduction of social solidarity between social borders, right, between states, and at the same time, it rests on the social reality of that social solidarity. I think this function is perhaps most manifested, or this theory and its consequences are most manifested in the designs of collective security or in proposals for collective security that emanated from Bourgeois in the process of drafting the League of Nations Covenant, and I think in particular in the creation of the International Labour Organization, in which those with connections to solidarist syndicalism seem to have played a significant role. So where does this leave us, pardon me, in terms of our thinking of the nature of solidarity as it is found in international law and its origins and the nature of its consequences? And so let me identify then basically two features that seem to me, or two dimensions that seem to be very evident. In the first instance, we've seen a direct impact or a direct connection between concepts such as collective security and a certain way of understanding the nature of international organizations as functional, as connected with the solidaristic or the ideal of solidarism and its theory of the functionalization of the state, which understands law as expressing objective relations uh, uh, of interdependence, and also at the same time expressing the requirements for social solidarity. However, we've also seen that solidarism was an important participant in and also contributed to the conceptual idea of intra-societal solidarity as part of the welfare state. And this concept of solidarity has an association which I think it's worth highlighting. It's not merely its connection with the promotion and design of welfarist policy, it also intimates a structural arrangement which is characterized by cost sharing and transfer payments that redistribute the burdens of economic misfortune and illness from those who can least afford to pay to those who can most afford to pay. So when we speak of welfare states as solidaristic, when we speak of solidaridad in this sense, in the way in which we talk about welfare states historically, we are invoking a structural relationship that seems to me to go all the way back to the concept of fraternity and the notion of fair shares for all, but also duties for those who participate in this arrangement. And I think, in a way, this is strikingly expressed in Lord Beveridge's explanation. Lord Beveridge being the one of the chief architects of the British welfare state, when he said, "We should regard want, disease, ignorance, and squalor as common enemies of all of us, not as enemies with whom each individual may seek a separate peace, escaping himself to personal prosperity while leaving his fellows in their clutches. That is the meaning of social conscience, that one should refuse to make a separate peace with social evil." So this implies, or this entails, first of all, a very martial metaphor. Right? One should refuse to make a social peace with social evil, a separate peace with social evil. But secondly, that to have solidarity is in some sense to have a structural relationship where those who are at risk of misfortune or illness or deprivation or suffering some form of injury are protected and supported by those who are less at risk or who can afford to pay in order to provide that support. So it is a relationship between rich and poor, between healthy and unhealthy, between old and young. We've heard a little bit about intergenerational equity. Well, intergenerational equity in the historical structural idea of solidarity entailed the young supporting the old. So I want to close then with this final observation, which I think is perhaps, which is to me, highlights this continuing significance of all of these dimensions of solidarity to our thinking in international law today. So writing in 1959, the Swedish economist Gunnar Myrdal, in his book Beyond the Welfare State, pointed to a basic, what he understood to be a basic challenge and contradiction entailed in the rise of national welfare. For him, national welfare was fundamentally the successful achievement of solidaristic policies. The solidarism or the solidarity was expressed not only through forms of public provision, a contract, as it were, between those who can afford to pay and those who suffer misfortune, but also forms of collective planning, all of which conduced towards national solidarity, national unity, in some sense, the perfection of the nation in the nation state. But he noted that this form of welfarism is economically nationalistic, but that it would fail in its in its relationships of solidarity with other parts of the world who might seek to build their own welfare systems, unless in some way it could be turned into a mechanism of international coordination which followed the same structural principle of welfare. For him, he called this concept the welfare world. And writing in 1959, his preoccupation was, how can we transfer the achievements of national solidarity, characterized by this structural principle, into an international order such that we can say it's properly characterized by international solidarity. Thank you very much.